Hello, everyone. Let me start with a big thank you to the organizers for inviting me to speak. And I will say that I'm deeply disappointed to not be there in person with all of you. I've been very much looking forward to this meeting for the last few months, and then life got in the way, unfortunately. I'm hoping I'll get a chance to see everyone in person before too long. So I'm going to start with some slides. So I'll share my screen. And the title of my talk is the same as the paper I submitted, but I actually like to talk about a couple different things. So the outline of the talk, I'll spend roughly the first half talking about the paper, more or less, which involved some parsing and tagging of historical Irish text, so pre-standard Irish text. But then I'd like to spend the second half talking about some new work that involves the development of a new repository for NLP data sets and benchmarks for Irish. So we'll start out with talking about the pre-standard Irish parsing. And to understand this, you have to understand that Irish went through a major standardization. So this occurred in the late 40s, early 50s, and involved major changes really to simplifications to the spelling and the grammatical system. Fortunately, almost everyone follows the rules of standard Irish nowadays. But what it means is that it introduced a major discontinuity in the historical Irish corpus. So if you look at older texts before, say, 1940, and you try and apply modern NLP tools to those older texts, it's just not going to work very well. So this is something we have to overcome. My interest in the problem came from work that I've done with the Historical Dictionary of Irish, which is an ongoing project at the Royal Irish Academy that targets modern Irish. So going back to the date they picked was 1600. So texts published in 1600. And in fact, if you're interested in browsing some of those texts as a side effect or a side project of the dictionary, they've put a corpus of about 3,000 texts published between 1600 and 1926 up on this very cool corpus.ria.ie website. So it's worth a look. So here's an example of a text. And what's going on here is that I wrote, starting about 15 years ago, a piece of software that standardizes Irish text, or at least attempts to do so. And in fact, I started it in about 2007 and have worked on it continuously since, more or less. And in fact, this was the paper that I presented at the first CLTW in Dublin in 2014. The approach that I took with this standardization was essentially a machine translation approach. And it's a kind of traditional statistical MT model. You can think of it as essentially a big phrase table and then a language model on the target side. The important thing here, and this will come back, is that it involves no interesting analysis of the pre-standard text. So I call it a shallow system. It does no tagging or parsing or anything of the pre-standard text. This is an example text just to kind of give you a feeling for the sorts of spelling changes that it puts into effect. And I've highlighted a couple examples here of many-to-one and one-to-many standardizations. The first one would be a many-to-one standardization, and the second one is a one-to-many. These play a role in what comes later. So traditionally, how have we handled processing pre-standard Irish texts when the modern tools that we have don't work well? Well, we more or less do the obvious thing, which is, given the existence of the standardizer, and really this is the reason I developed it, we can take an older text, we can run it through the standardizer, which outputs word level alignments like on that previous slide. This is critical for what comes later. You have to have those word level alignments to do what I'm proposing here. You then take the standardized text and you run it through our tools for the modern language, say a tagger or a parser. and then project those annotations back to the original text. And again, you need the word level alignments to do this projection. The number I recall from the paper is something like 97.5% of tokens are aligned one-to-one with their standardization. That other 2.5% is some mix of many-to-one and one-to-many, which needs some special handling. So in the case of a one-to-many standardization, which was, I guess, the second one highlighted on the previous slide, the solution is very simple. What we do in universal dependencies, we talk about multi-word tokens. So we think of it as a single token at pre-standard text that effectively represents multiple words. And therefore, the multiple words, the multiple tags that we get from the standardized tagger are simply projected back onto those two subwords or pieces of that token. So that's sort of a trivial solution. The interesting case, and the more difficult case, is the case of many-to-one standardization. So you have two tokens in the pre-standard text that standardize to a single one. Therefore, the tagger, the modern tagger, gives you a single part of speech tag, say. How do you project that back to two different tokens? Again, I don't have a very clever solution. The idea that I used was simply to just build up a database of a little more than 750 of these most common many-to-one standardizations, and then just manually tag the individual pieces. So together, that is a description of an algorithm that you can use for tagging or parsing pre-standard Irish texts. And in fact, this is essentially the pipeline that's used for the corpus.ria.ie website, where the modern tool that's used is Elaine Ihonhu's part of speech tagger. The big question is, how well does this work? We have impressionistically looked at the results, and it seems like it works pretty well. But to this point, there was no formal evaluation of the quality of this part of speech pipeline. So what I did, and really the main point of the paper, was to build a big test set. And well, not that big. So 150 sentences, just under 4,000 tokens, selected to be representative of pre-standard text, pre-standard Irish as much as possible with such a small corpus. What I did was I chose 25 sentences each from 3 20th century texts. So one from each of the major dialects of Irish. I called this the older corpus. And then 25 sentences from 3 other much more challenging texts that I call the oldest corpus. Those 3 texts are the 1602 New Testament translation, so the first translation of the Bible into Irish, taking us right back to the beginning of that 1600 window. Forest Fassa Éireann is a book by Geoffrey Keating, published in the 1630s, extremely important historical text in Irish. Also very challenging from text processing point of view. And then a third text, which is actually from the 19th century, but among these is actually the most difficult. This is a diary, so a handwritten diary by essentially a gentleman farmer in Southern Ireland, written in the 1820s. Because it's a diary, the spelling is very idiosyncratic and so on, and it's extremely challenging to do anything interesting. And then what I did was I just manually tagged and parsed using the Universal Dependencies Guidelines, these 150 sentences, and this became our gold standard test corpus for lemmatization, tagging, and parsing. And it's now available as part of the overall Universal Dependencies project. It'll be part of the next official release. The remainder of the paper involves experiments, so actually evaluating our pipeline and deciding how well it works. I want to go through this very quickly because I'd like to get to the other half of the talk. But a quick tour of this table. We have various models that I tested here. I'll only really talk about the first 3, and then 3 test corpora. So these are the 3 20th century books, so 75 sentences there. And then these are the 75 sentences from the 3 older, more challenging books. These texts are from Teresa Lynn's Modern Irish UD corpus. So this is the test set from those. And this is just to compare how well things work on Modern Irish. The 3 models I'll talk about very quickly. The first one, the UD model, is really just Teresa's dependency parser. So trained using her training set. And again, it's very good results on Modern Irish. First observation is that, right, that tool trained on Modern Irish performs pretty badly on older and the oldest corpus. We knew that, right? But this sort of confirms that with some numerical evidence. The second row is the projecting parser. That's the one I just described the last couple slides. So standardize, apply Teresa's parser and tagger, and then project those annotations back to the original text. Those give the best results on the older and the oldest corpus, right? So far and away the best results. So this is encouraging that the process and the tools that we're using appear to work quite well. The interesting thing to me is this third line. So this is what I call the silver parser. What I did was I took the remainder of those 6 books. So accepting the 150 sentences, I took the remainder of those and I ran them through the projecting parser to produce a big annotated corpus of several thousand sentences. And then and I did not correct the annotations just as they came out of the projecting parser. And then I used those as training data for a brand new parser. All right, so this is why I call them silver data instead of gold standard data. What's amazing is that by so doing, the resulting parser achieves pretty good results. In fact, results that are not quite up to the projecting parser, but comparable. Now, why would you care about this? Well, because this silver model doesn't use the standardizer at all. All right, I'll come back and say another word about this on the final slide. So the takeaway observations are, we've confirmed that the modern taggers and parsers don't do so well on older text. That's not a surprise. The pipeline that we've been using on the historical dictionary project gives very good results and the best results of all the things that I tried. But again, this observation that even with no gold standard training data, so I didn't have to manually annotate a huge corpus, and with no direct use of the standardizer, even though it's sort of implicitly used to produce the silver training data, I have a tagger and parser that give me competitive results. What this tells me is that if I put in the effort, someone puts in the effort to manually annotate a big gold standard corpus for pre-standard Irish, chances are very good that we will eventually exceed the performance of the projecting parser. And by so doing, we potentially can just eliminate the standardizer entirely from this pipeline. This is appealing in many ways. The idea is we're trying to build a tool that acts directly on pre-standard Irish without having to have this intervening tool. The intervening tool introduces errors, right? And then the other issue is that it forces us into modern Irish, which essentially throws away a lot of the complexity of older varieties of Irish. So essentially there's a plateau of how well we can expect this approach to work. By getting rid of the standardizer, ideally we can exceed that plateau. All right, so that is all I'll say about that. I'd like to move on and talk about this set of evaluation corpora. So I probably don't have to explain to anybody the importance of evaluation. Evaluating NLP tools on standard test sets is a critical part of research in this field. Good news is that this is an idea that's being widely embraced, and we've made great leaps forward even in the last 5 or 10 years. So there are great websites like Papers with Code, there's NLP Progress, You can go to Hugging Face and see not just data sets that you can download, but implementations and essentially leaderboards that will tell you which implementations work better than which other ones. So this is all great, right? This has made research in this field move forward very quickly, and has made it easy to get your hands on standard data sets and allows you to compare your results with published results by other researchers. So that's all to good, but there are definitely some issues with this. And one of them is what's sometimes called leaderboard culture. Now, the quick summary is that papers are now sometimes viewed as publishable if and only if they achieve state-of-the-art results on some standard benchmark. So even if you have a great idea, and when you implement that idea, maybe it comes up a little short of the best, I don't know, blue score on English, German machine translation, you might be that you get your paper rejected because somebody would say, well, maybe it's an interesting idea, but it doesn't better the state of the art, right? So what's the point? I think that's a destructive perspective to take on research. So for various reasons. So one of the things is that it rewards teams with the biggest data sets and the most GPUs and the ability to search for the best hyperparameters and so on to achieve state of the art, even if their ideas are not so interesting. So for example, if I just I train a brand new pre-trained model on a huge corpus that I've collected from the web, and I just plug it into some standard algorithm for text classification. Is that interesting research? It's not to me, but I read more and more papers like this. If I improve the state of the art simply by tweaking the hyperparameters in some existing algorithm, is that interesting research? Again, it's not interesting research to me, but this is what happens when the first bullet point happens to be true. So if the only way you're going to get a paper published is by achieving state of the art, then you invest a lot of time and effort into things that aren't so interesting. And then I'd like to raise other issues that are especially critical in the context of minoritized languages like the Celtic languages. And namely that we don't have the luxury of separating research and application that maybe you have as a researcher working on English. So for example, if I improve the state of the art, but my code is too slow, or can't sit in RAM or whatever it is, so that I can't put it in the hands of users, is that interesting? Well, maybe it's interesting research, right? And maybe it's something that will lead to an application 10 years from now. But in the case of Irish, for sure, and probably the other 5 Celtic languages, it's not something that I care about. And we have environmental impacts. You can improve the state of the art, but by training on a cluster of GPUs for a month and pumping a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere, is that a good thing? You can decide for yourself. And then all of the issues around biases contained in these large pre-trained models. If I can build a bigger and bigger pre-trained model, but it has horrible racist or sexist bias in it, have I made the world a better place? Again, you can decide for yourself. So I was motivated in part by kind of a lot of introspection over the last couple of years, and kind of looking at my own work over the last 25 years. Now, quick summary is that I think I do a good job writing open source software, putting things up on my GitHub account, and so on. I'm very bad about writing papers. And so it's sort of it's a trade-off in a sense. So what I'd like to do is I would like to take a lot of the code and data sets and so on that I've used that I have not written papers about and make them available to other researchers to kind of kickstart their work in this area. So I have tons of examples of data sets and things that I've worked on here and there, things that have come out of classes that I've taught, lots of things that I've manually annotated over the years. Quite a few are already available online, but there are quite a few others that are not. So a big part of this is getting a lot of that work out into the open. Again, with the main aim being, let's jumpstart research on a lot of these problems, just where previously people didn't have access to a good data set for training and testing their models. I would like to do so in a way that transcends the issues on the previous slide, and I'll talk a little bit about how I would like to do that. The second part, and what I think is the most important, is that, again, unlike English, it is critical in the context of minoritized language that we support non-researchers, people who don't care about achieving state of the art, but perhaps would like to use some of these NLP tools as part of their website, their app, or whatever it is that they need to do. Make it easy for them to get their hands on, if not a state-of-the-art implementation, something very close to it. And again, this isn't so important for English, but for Irish, it's really important that we could get these implementations in the hands of the people who need them. This came up just in a conversation we had with the English-Irish Dictionary Project last week. They were talking about being able to identify dialects in their corpus. And I think Alva was on the call and mentioned, I think Kevin Scannell had done something with that, which happened to be true. I never wrote a paper about it, right? But I've got some code and a data set on my GitHub account. This is a perfect example, right? That is something where that dictionary project could have made very good use out of this script that I'd written had they only known about it or been able to find it. All right, so that is the motivation. So the name of the project is GBB, like seeming like all of the modern language models and so on. It has to be a pun on BERT. So I'll explain the pun in a second. The Irish speakers will get it. So the basic idea is that it is a new repository of data sets and then also benchmark baseline implementations for Irish NLP tasks. I have the repository up. It is far from complete, definitely a work in progress. I'd hoped to make lots of progress the last couple of weeks, but haven't been able to. And again, it is bringing together data sets that I've built over the last 20 plus years, and each one coming with a baseline Python implementation that anybody can use, and that can be used as a way of comparing various approaches, like you would in a leaderboard. And the motivation being, let's jumpstart research, but then also have easy to use implementations for developers. The tasks that I have in mind are the following 25 tasks. Some of these I'm using, say, Teresa Lynn's Universal Dependencies corpus, right? So this GBB site will just link out to Teresa's corpus for that, and so on and so forth. But the majority of these are data sets that I've put together myself over the years. Again, very much work in progress. I think I only have about 2 or 3 of these that are fully fleshed out. Many of the data sets are already up, but the implementations are still work in progress. So to explain the name, there's an old proverb, Gerien Bert Boher, with an extra I, and the metaphor was sort of too irresistible. It means sort of 2 people shorten the road, but more metaphorically, when sort of 2 people work together, they can make better progress. And that sort of segues into the idea here, which is sort of collaborative versus competitive advancing of the field. So instead of having people compete to be on the top of a leaderboard, the idea is that as a community of people interested in Irish NLP, we are collaborating to build the best tools possible, period. And to me, this looks more like open source software development than it does research. New ideas or tweaks to parameters or new algorithms or whatever it is are simply made to these repositories via GitHub pull requests. And then again, more like open source development, less like research. I'm trying to separate this project entirely from academic publication. So if you have a great idea, right, you should go ahead and write a paper about that idea. It should have nothing to do with what happens on one of these leaderboards. Similarly, I would really encourage people to tweak parameters, right? So tune the hyperparameters of some existing algorithm. And if you bump up the performance of state of the art on one of these tasks, that's great. And that advancement will live in this repository for other people to benefit from. But then please don't write a paper about it. The implementations I intend to be citable as well. And then anybody who contributes the code is part of that citation. And then I've just linked out to one of the ones that's kind of the best fleshed out. If you checked out the one on diacritic restoration, that's got a few implementations already. So quick summary to wrap up. I've got a new centralized repository for Irish NLP. Benchmarks and data sets eventually for 25 tasks, some of the data sets released for the first time. And eventually we'll have strong baseline implementations that anybody can download and use and then ideally improve upon. And we will have leaderboards on the GitHub READMEs, but without names attached to them, right? So this is as a community, which algorithms are working the best. And that's all I have. So thanks, everyone.